Hello and welcome to this week's What Were They Thinking? Among this week's news items, RFK Jr. admits that there isn't enough evidence to claim tylenol is linked to autism, which should have been the case from the get-go. Memory problems are increasing in adults under 40, which is a concerning figure if entirely true and extrapolated to the rest of the world. Scientists in the UK have recently demanded that bacon and ham products carry health warnings similar to those found on cigarettes. Australia is even weirder with a massive burning object that's likely fallen from space found in a desert. Snakes have figured out a way to eat toxic frogs by removing the poison. DNA has revealed what really killed Napoleon's forces, and Singapore is to bring back corporal punishment for scammers. The timestamps for these and other news items can be found in the description box below. We'll start with RFKrayKray, and not just because he's insane, because of brainworms, but because he tried claiming that tylenol, or paracetamol, acetaminophen, however you wish to call it, was linked to autism and causing it. This, of course, is complete bullshit, and the claim had no substance to it. The problem is that his retraction of this comes much after his initial claims. The initial claims, like any alarming or exaggerated piece of trivia, novelty, hyperbolic statements like this tend to get more attention and more traction with the media than the actual warnings should. It's similar to, say, how the room temperature semiconductor discovery in Korea got a lot of attention initially, people saying, oh look, they've managed to achieve it at long last, only for it to be found out that it was fraud, but the fraud element was very, very understated. And this is where RFKrayKray is not only stupid, but really not living up to his role as Health and Human Services Secretary. He puts it as not sufficient evidence, which is a much softer way of saying we can't actually prove what we've said, which is another way of saying he lied, which is not really that new. RFKrayKray has made repeated lies about the role of, say, vaccines and autism, where he said the CDC was hiding the evidence. The evidence wasn't hidden, it was just published in multiple parts. And obviously, if you only look at one, you're going to miss what's in the others. So, this brings us to his actual claim. We've all said from the beginning that the causative association between Tylenol given in pregnancy is not sufficient to say it definitively caused autism, but it is very suggestive according to RFKrayKray. But no, that's not what it is. It's not suggestive. It's not even anything of the kind. The association between the two is, at best, vaguely correlative, but correlative is not causative, and importantly, in this instance, the evidence over time is clear. The use of Tylenol or acetaminophen, however you wish to call it, over time has not changed drastically, and any changes that have occurred have shown no relative effect on the prevalence of autism, meaning that there is no association, and we're just saying association, not even correlation or causation. RFKrayKray's actions are, for all intents and purposes, the exact copy of what anti-vaxxers and flat earthers do by cherry-picking specific studies or similar and then claiming, look, we found proof, without having considered the rest of the research, which is utterly irresponsible. Going on to actual medical news that's relevant and important to know about, we have an arguably much older article, and this is purely an article, but it's an article that's worth talking about because of what's happening. It's based in Uganda, and it's essentially scandal, wherein students were given the wrong drug, thinking it was a deworming medication. It was not deworming medication, and unfortunately this led to at least 44 pupils being hospitalized. Now the question we have is, how on earth they managed to mistake the two medications, remembering that these are not anywhere close to the same thing. In fact, we're going to go so far as to say that they are extremely different. To get these two medications wrong, you would have to have someone who's dispatching the drugs get it wrong, the receiver getting it wrong, the people who are administering it getting it wrong, or having no one at all at any point in this entire chain check what was on the packaging. Or, importantly, what quantities they were giving. That is a pretty big problem. And, of course, who gives that much phenobarbital in the first place? That's a lot. And so we basically bring ourselves to the, how do we put this? How did you not only get it wrong, but how did you then give so much to so many students that you nearly hospitalized half of them? Yes, there are possibilities they could mistake it based on the sizing, shape, color, etc. for the medication, but really, that still requires that they ignore the very clear labeling on the packaging. Going next to medical news that's somewhat more pressing for the future, there's an increase in the number of Americans who are having memory decline issues. Now, this is either they're trying to forget the terrible years of lockdown, which most people can at least somewhat appreciate, but alternatively it is actually a more prevalent issue that's going to cause cognitive disability in the coming decades, with more and more people being affected. The Utah University research found that those aged between 18 and 39 had the biggest increase in cognitive disability in the past 10 years. This is, however, based on survey data from about 4.5 million people, which is a slight concern. Interesting, however, is that there was a notable decline in those over 70. And so it would indicate that something's working for those who are elderly, but not for those who are younger. The problems we have with this are that it's effectively self-reported data and based on a survey. So this presents several issues. One is that it's nearly always a self-selecting audience that responds to surveys. Second, the survey respondents aren't always the most accurate. Third and finally, well, who knows how reliable they are, and if there are any complicating issues in the background that might be contributing to this. Yeah, this is a problem with it. The researchers did start accounting for some of the variables, and by some of the variables we're talking about things like socioeconomics and some structural factors. So things like, say, income. Lower income meant a higher probability of decline. Lower educational attainment saw the same thing. Certain demographic groups had the more notable decrease in cognitive function. And there are a few other variables that they accounted for, but even with that in mind, there seems to be a, let's say, large amount of variability in what they're looking at, who, what, and why, especially if we have COVID-19 to account for. The reality is that long COVID is a thing and may be a considered factor in their research. Next we have dieting news, and not just that dieting is sadness incarnate, although that is true as well. It's research into intermittent fasting, and, well, that it may not actually work as well as thought. Not so much that it's entirely useless, although yes, there's a certain amount of limitation in it. Rather that it could be having, let's say, how do we put this politely? It might be having negative effects that aren't necessarily obvious. Let's start with that. That might be the nicest way to describe the research. The physiological benefits of intermittent fasting are that it's meant to basically have your body go into a semi-starvation state and go, oh, I need to use the resources, in this term fat, in the body and burn that instead of burning the fuel that is available in the form of glycogen and glucose in your body from the last meal. So that all makes sense, in theory anyway. However, the research found that if you're looking at people's cognitive function during this, and compare it to when they were fed normally, people were far more handicapped by intermittent fasting. The good news is that this is based on a meta-analysis, so we do have considerably more data. It's more data, but not really. It's a lot of studies. It's 71 independent studies, which sounds like a lot until you realize that there's only 3,500 participants or thereabouts. And from that, there are a whole lot of different measurements, 222. And the other issue is that it spans 7 decades, or nearly 7 decades, from 1958 to 2025. That means that you now have big problems in the variability of study design, all sorts of things go into this, but assuming for now that yes, there is more to it than what you would think, there is supposed to be some notable differences. So if you're older, there's no measurable decline in mental performance when fasting, but children and adolescents do suffer from it. That is, basically, kids and teenagers structurally suffer more when the energy supply in their body from food fluctuates notably. There's also timing. Timing doesn't seem to have any effect, but there's also some relationship between duration and effect, so you need to consider that. The longer you perform your fasting for, the smaller the gap between fasted and fed states becomes. There's also, let's say, considerably more variability in results, depending on when in the day the testing is conducted. For example, if you conduct tests for this later in the day, there's a significantly greater result due to circadian rhythms. In short, like any diet, the variability by person is going to be significant, and it's certainly not going to be appropriate for everybody and everywhere. Next we come to food, and the claims from UK researchers that bacon and ham products should have similar health warnings to those on cigarettes. Now we assume they're not telling you to either smoke your bacon or ham, mostly because it's already been smoked, typically, or that you're going to get, say, the cancer eye or similar. Their argument instead is that these meats, which are often preserved with chemicals called nitrites, do pose a cancer risk. This is the Californian argument of anything and everything that might cause cancer should therefore get a big yellow sticker that says this thing is known to cause cancer in the state of California. The reason they have that is because people just don't want to be sued. But this is not California, and this is not the same thing. They haven't accounted for some of the same problems, however, that California does. Because California just goes, oh, it's on a list that we found? Cool. Slap a sticker on it and tell people it's dangerous. Much like California, this doesn't account for things like dose, regularity of exposure, individual variability, the actual individual ingredients, and everything else. It just goes, oh, there's an association? Dangerous. Which is not only extreme overreaction, but more than being an overreaction, it creates unnecessary panic and it dilutes the actual meaning of this kind of warning. If everything has this warning, no one pays attention to it. To give you a rough approximation of why this is such a terrible and dumb idea, if the UK government was to apply this kind of classification to ham and similar, it would be in the same carcinogenic group as tobacco and asbestos. Understand, asbestos is basically banned everywhere except America because America is special. But tobacco is recognized in just about every country under the sun that it causes cancer, with a few very vague exceptions that basically exist because the governments can't afford to be sued by the tobacco companies. But that's the comparison they're trying to draw. A known carcinogen in the form of asbestos, which is basically you get asbestosis, or cancer in your lungs from asbestos, you get a lump sum payment from the company. There's no questions, no doubt, that's how clear the association is. Tobacco is not much less, except there's no mass settlement yet. And they want to put ham and bacon in this category. No, just no. To be clear about it, the link between certain foods and, in this case, cancer, could more strongly and more explicitly be made for things like alcohol. And we would strongly suspect that any, let's say, a peak representative body for ham and bacon would turn around to the UK government and say, okay, you want to regulate us? Fine. You want to put a warning on our product? Fine. But you'll have to do the same thing to every other product in the same category, including alcohol, which in the UK, and given the volume of beer and cider consumed in the UK, let alone other beverages, it's unlikely to ever pass muster, because this would be considered a unreasonable burden and certainly a rather targeted and possibly discriminatory bit of law if they were to apply it. In similar food-related news, but still dangerous for you, there are certain genetic conditions that can turn some otherwise perfectly healthy and good foods dangerous for you, which is really not something you want to be experiencing, let's say. and it's down to something called hereditary fructose intolerance. In short, if you consume something full of fructose, most likely something like, say, fruit, or even honey, sugar, similar things, you experience a phenomena very similar to, say, lactose intolerance, lactose allergies, or gluten intolerance and allergies, because that's what this effectively is. We compare it more to lactose intolerance than we would, say, gluten intolerance or allergies, mostly because, much like with lactose intolerance, the human body for these individuals lacks the enzyme needed. This is aldolase B, or beta, and what it does is it breaks down fructose and makes it useful. Because the body doesn't have that enzyme, the fructose begins to develop in the liver, kidneys, and intestines, and this is what can then lead to some pretty significant health concerns. Seizures, coma, and, obviously in extreme cases given the previous two conditions, death. But it's death from a liver and kidney failure. Now, the way that happens is fairly straightforward, thankfully. The sugar building up in other parts of the body basically leads to water being drawn away from where it should be, and leading to a whole bunch of people basically having neurons and other parts of their body lacking the necessary water volume to stay functional, therefore leading to their death of those neurons and other cells for that matter, and from there you end up, well, either finding yourself in the forever box, or experiencing a very long nap that you wake up from and go, where am I, and why is everybody standing around me? Thankfully, this is not a condition that's necessarily easy to acquire, let's call it. It is rare, with about 1 in 10,000 people, although this number does vary notably by location and similar things. The reason for this rarity is that you need to get 1 copy from each of your parents. If you don't have 2 copies, you should be fine. But it does mean you can become a carrier. The carriers aren't affected by it, but those carriers can pass it on to their offspring. And therein lies the trap. And not the usual kind of trap where you think it's a girl and turns out to be a boy. No, we mean an actual trap here. And, of course, nobody becomes aware of it until babies begin eating solid food, because that solid food contains the fructose that then activates this, or at least plays on it. The problem with this condition, other than the fact that it's going to cause death eventually if undiagnosed, is that the only way to really deal with it is that you need to avoid eating the following: fruits, all fruits, any juice, any canned fruit, and any other fruit products, cereals and grains with added sugars, honey, molasses, dried fruit, or any sweet flavorings. Vegetables are fine, except those that are typically on the sweeter end of things, peas, corn, beetroot, onions, pumpkin, sweet potatoes, carrots, and zucchini. You need to have only bread that's made without any added sugar or sweeteners. You want to avoid sweetened desserts or any kind of flavored yogurt. You want non-sweetened or flavored red meat, chicken, turkey, fish, beans, and lentils. You can also eat eggs, tofu, and tempeh, but you want to avoid anything that's being processed, sausages, deli meats, and marinated meats. And you need to be very cautious with other foods. The sauces, dressings, and condiments are the typical guilty parties, mostly because they will contain some sort of fructose ingredient. So yes, it's essentially you have to have the most boring and bland of diets, sort of anyway, but also you are going to have to just deal with it because the alternative is death. Shifting now to Australia, where, well, Australia's on fire. Not the usual annual Australia's on fire, which should be occurring about this time of year anyway. No, this is an actual something came from space and set fire to it. A large chunk of something was discovered in the Pilbara Desert of Western Australia, and the current theory is it's space junk that re-entered Earth's atmosphere, and, well, that's about all we really know at the moment, thanks to the Western Australian Police Force. Miners alerted emergency services somewhere around October 18th that they had this weird burning thing here, which in Australia is probably not that weird a call to make to the police. Hey police, we found something on fire. And they're like, okay, is it meant to be on fire? Well, we don't know because we don't know what it is. Oh, we'll send someone out. Yeah. The initial investigations all point to some sort of part of a spacecraft, and the most likely answer is that it was a Jialing rocket, something from China, launched back in September. So this is not going to be great from a political perspective either now. Not only is part of nature on fire, but the Chinese are dropping their waste products on Australia, which is kind of like poking the bear. Australia doesn't need to go to war. Australia just needs to ship over a shipping container full of their wildlife and let them go ham, ironically, on the Chinese, and they probably will win. Or alternatively, just send over a whole battalion of emus. Australia lost a war to them, China's probably not going to be much better off. In animal news now, we have what has been called impossible life found beneath the Arctic ice. And theoretically, this could have implications for various climate models. Theoretically is the important word there. What scientists have found is a special form of life that lives under the Arctic sea ice. Now, this was assumed to be impossible, and not just because it's a dark place, which, well, high school is a dark place and kids survive there mostly fine, unless they're in America, in which case we assume they survive there as long as they don't go through a school shooting. But instead, what we're talking about here is the dark and cold, which is more like a dysfunctional family home. Again, though, people survive, and we assume so can some sort of weird microbial organism. This is where we get to the bizarre phenomena. Microbes that were able to take vague amounts of nitrogen, roughly 78% of Earth's atmosphere, and not only survive, but use it to fix that nitrogen in place. The inhospitable environment is assumed to be so inhospitable, and that Earth is such a death world, that it would be impossible for this to happen. Then again, they have already found some nitrogen-fixing microbial organisms in cold Arctic waters. So really, all they've done is find cold Arctic waters that are dark now. The difference is that, unlike, let's say, other microbial organisms that have been found, they haven't necessarily found that these organisms are actively doing so, only that they have the genetics necessary to do so. This would indicate that somehow they are still perfectly functional, still perfectly alive, and still theoretically doing what they should be doing in a place that shouldn't be possible to do so. What makes this significant for climate models is that theoretically the deep, dark, cold oceans that we're talking about could have more microbial organisms, meaning more algae, meaning more CO2 from the atmosphere could be incorporated into algae, leading to more algae blooms, leading to more fish eating the algae, sort of helping to dampen the effect of mostly nitrogen in the atmosphere and global warming, but not necessarily so. Again, maybe. The exact implications are hard to tease out because incredibly complex and incredibly difficult to predict that much of a complex system with the models we currently have available. In what should have been inevitable and predictable is how snakes deal with the issue of frogs being poisonous. And yes, frogs are figuring out how to deal with, well, poisonous frogs. This is based in the Amazon, so the Amazon's already exciting enough. Giant snakes, dangerous frogs, insects that want to kill you. It's not quite Australia levels of insanity, but it's trying its hardest. Snakes in the Amazon are, instead of just eating the frogs, which would be the obvious and inevitable result, wipe the poison off of these frogs and then consume them. This is the dart frog. The dart frog is very poisonous. In fact, it's one of the most deadly frogs in the world. It has the histotoxins and pumalotoxins and decahydroquinolones. These all interfere with essential cell proteins, and the researchers have found that at least 6 snakes would have preferred to go hungry than eat these frogs, but the other 4 found a way to kill them and eat them, but before eating them, they would drag the frogs across the ground. This is rubbing off the toxins or poisons that are on the outside of the frog. Admittedly, only 3 of the 4 frogs survived, so it does mean that there's a fairly high fatality rate if you do consume them anyway. But it does indicate that at least 3 of the 4 frogs did have some sort of adaptation, meaning that they're able to cope with residual amounts of poison. It's similar to, say, how the human body can deal with small amounts of pterodotoxin from pufferfish, mostly by getting high. Snakes are not the only creatures that are making their way in the world and adapting to the environment, or in the case of snakes, adapting to the poison in the environment. Rats are also doing something similar, although we should say they're doing something similar in a broad sense. What they've done is adapt to finding a new way to hunt prey. Rats in Germany are, instead of just hunting down ground-dwelling creatures, stealing your food, or just being a nuisance, are catching bats, literally waiting and jumping to intercept bats as they fly by, which, given it's at night time, is rather hard to do and somewhat impressive. They do, however, have a roughly 50% success rate, which isn't so great. Out of 30 attempts, 13 were successful, and a rat warren nest, they call it a cache, but that feels too fancy for what rats make, contained 52 rat carcasses. So yes, it would appear that rats have found new ways to hunt at night, and new prey to hunt at night, although this kind of makes sense given their, let's say, loadout. Rats can hunt in complete darkness because their whiskers are sensitive to the air currents from the bat's wing beats, and they can grab prey with their forepaws. This does mean that theoretically, rats could kill a large number of bats per winter. The estimate is that a colony of 15 to 60 rats could kill anywhere between 2,100 and 8,400 bats each winter, which would be equivalent to roughly 7% of the region's bat population, which is rather unfortunate. Next we go to history and archaeology, and specifically looking at Napoleonic history. Now, we know that General Winter is responsible for the death of Napoleon's forces as they marched into Russia, the same way that every force that has tried to enter Russia has failed inevitably. What happened to Napoleon and his army in particular is what's interesting. Apart from the fact they had dwindling supplies and a very fierce Russian resistance, they had another problem as well. The 600,000 strong force of soldiers not only dealt with winter, starvation, but disease, and disease is one of the important factors here. People can to an extent survive starvation for several weeks. As long as they get some food eventually, they'll be okay. Cold can be overcome eventually, but disease on top of everything else is a problem. And so they've looked at genetic data, particularly from bodies that have been buried for about 200 years, which does raise some concerns. What they found is that perhaps the documented claims of typhus at the time may not be entirely correct. What they found, after looking at the remains of 13 soldiers, is that they had a paratyphoid caused by a strain of Salmonella enterica. They also had a fever caused by a bacterium called Borrelia recurrentis, which is transmitted by body lice. So it wasn't just one disease, it was a quasi-form of typhoid, and a second disease which caused fever and transmitted by body lice, which is probably not that great. The reason we say not that great is that given that you're cold, hungry, and tired, the chances of them bothering to actually maintain good hygiene are low, and it would be a good indication, a very good indication, that the individuals would be repeatedly infected with both of these conditions, leading to a death spiral, figuratively and literally. Surprisingly, the researchers are very candid about the fact that their research is handicapped considerably, and that they only looked at 13 individuals. They believe that there are up to 3,000 bodies in a mass grave in Vilnius, Lithuania, that could also be examined, and that this means they cannot rule out typhus, only that in these individuals they didn't find it. Next we go to dumb law enforcement. And we say dumb law enforcement in the same way that we think UK's arresting of a teenager dressed up as Hunk from Resident Evil was stupid. He did do some dumb things with his cosplay, but not dumb enough to be arrested. And we would argue the same thing applies here, where a UK man has been arrested and ended up pleading guilty because he had a recipe for gunpowder. Now, from what we can tell, it's not smokeless powder, but it is gunpowder. And that's weird because, frankly, it's so well known that having it would be almost common knowledge at this point. But apparently the UK does not view it this way. Having a recipe for it is supposed to be the same as having knowledge about how to commit a terrorist offence or to facilitate a terrorist offence. The UK's biggest issue with terrorism at the moment is knives and acid attacks, not gunpowder. But they've arrested this guy anyway, and he's pled guilty. He will now get 3 years and 9 months in prison. And the thing is, it's just a handwritten recipe. It's not as though he's done anything more than go, yeah, this is how you make it. Now, we don't at all agree with the slippery slope argument that's being made by the particular author in this case after that, but we do take issue with the actual event itself. And simply because there are plenty of things that are either by virtue of common sense or necessity for safety that people know how to make that would fit into the same category and be far more realistic to make. Things like, say, mustard gas, chloroform. There are all sorts of chemicals that you can make that would cause more harm more immediately and be more easily made than gunpowder. Because making gunpowder in this way, assuming you don't have access to the raw chemicals needed, would take years, theoretically. The final news item we have for you is marginally more entertaining, and it's simply because we feel like there's a certain schadenfreude to it. Singapore caned scammers as billions are lost to fraud surges in recent years. Now, the actual process is, let's say, not exactly pleasant for the scammer, but then again, considering what they do, kind of deserved. The scammer is going to basically be stripped bare, as far as we can tell. The executioner? But we can't think of quite the right word for this. We'll have a cane that's 1.2 meters, or effectively 4 feet in length. The stroke speed, which we're confused as to how they're going to get the stroke speed down, but sure, is going to be 160 kilometers an hour, or roughly the equivalent of 100 miles an hour. And the legal limit says that they will only be hit 24 times at most. Now, we're trying to figure out if this means 24 times at most per caning or in total, because this is going to be rough. The individual will, however, have some very, very slim concessions made. First of all, they'll get a padding to protect their kidneys, which, yeah, okay, fair enough. Kidney failure as a result of being caned is probably not great, but they will be strapped to what looks basically like a ladder. It's described as a trestle, but look, it's a ladder. There's very few ways about it, and we would argue that given the whole thing about walking under a ladder is bad luck, we presume being strapped to a ladder is even worse luck, based on this alone. Finally, there will be a doctor present. That's to make sure that if the caning is too severe, well, you go back to your cell to heal for weeks, and then you get the rest of your lashes, which, oof, this is, damn. You might be thinking, oh, well, this is a light punishment for scammers. No, it's really not. To be clear about it, after 4 or 5 strikes, lashes, whatever you wish to call it, they are basically flayed and can be going into shock as a consequence. It is very painful, and one of the arguments against it was that somebody who had experienced this themselves basically still had nightmares about it years later. Which, given what scammers do and the effect it can have on someone's life, we have mixed thoughts about that. The only problem we can see with this in the end is twofold. One, if they unfortunately get some sort of masochist showing up who really enjoys their experience, which is going to be an interesting time. When you get to 24 and they go, no, give me more, yeah. Second, which is probably more practical, they need to ensure the individuals who receive punishment actually survive, and there is a considerable risk around things like infection, necrosis around the tissues that are damaged, and similar, that will require considerable levels of medical care, both immediately afterwards and for a time after the caning has occurred. That's all the news we have for you this week. Thank you for watching. If you have found it interesting, consider liking, sharing, and subscribing, and please do post any comments, questions, or suggestions you have below.